Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's great to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming to the session. It's kind of personally very special for me. And I want to kick things right off. We tend to live in a world where when we think about technology and the future of science, our societies, we tend to think in very techno-dystopian ways. It was really refreshing for me to hear our president this morning give a little bit more of a cheerful outlook of how technology and democracy can work together. But usually, especially when you hear German politicians speak or people in authority and power, the outlook is kind of dark and bleak. So the session here today is bringing together different experts, different designers, people of different professions who are all interested in thinking about desirable futures. We have titled the session Science Fiction as a Method because some of us who are going to meet in this next session believe that we need to sort of think outside the box, as you say. And science fiction can enable us to do so by providing us with narratives for futures that we want to attain. Narratives and vocabulary for new kinds of structures, new kinds of societies, new kinds of technologies that will hopefully serve people and public interests. And so I'm very happy to welcome different panelists here on stage. You see a lot of chairs. That's because the format of the session is a fishbowl, and we want to invite you to join our discussion. If you have your own methodologies and your own ideas on the subject on how to use different methods, including science fiction, to design desirable futures. So I'd like to bring those panelists up on stage. Please welcome with me Zöllner, Shalev Moran, Michelle Christensen, and Sina Kamala Kaufmann. I want to give them all a proper introduction and give you a couple more sentences on the format for the session before we begin. So I'm very happy to have you all here on stage with me today. Michelle Christensen is a sociologist and designer exploring different spaces in exactly the topics that I've just sketched out. She researches currently at the Design Research Lab, which is part of the University of Arts here in Berlin, and her interests include post-disciplinarity, the politics of objects, and the dimensions of thingness. And I'm very much looking forward to having you explain a little bit more of what these things mean to us today. I'm also very happy to have Sina Kamala Kaufmann here with me. She is an author, an actual science fiction author, if you want, here from Berlin. And she's published this wonderful book called Helle Materie, which I had the pleasure of talking about with her yesterday at the Netzfest stage. It's a collection of different, very thought-provoking essays that try to take us into that near future. And Sina is going to be sharing with us her methodology that she uses as an author today. Those are the two fantastic women that you see sitting left and right from me, and left and right from them accordingly. I'm very happy to welcome Shalev Moran, who is a game designer, a curator, and an artist currently based in Copenhagen. He is games program creator for the Print Screen Festival in Holland, and is currently studying at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. He also co-founded a project called Speculative Tourism, which he's going to share with us today, as well as representing what we would like to call the Designing Tomorrow's Collective, that will hopefully be something as a think tank that we're both a part of, as well as some other fantastic people in this room who I hope are going to use that empty chair shortly. And last but not least, I'm really happy to welcome Zöllner here on stage. Christian is design fiction and speculative design professor at the Burg-Gieving Steinart University, and he is also part of the Constitute, which is a design and research studio doing really fantastic work. Maybe some of you visited the Fabmobile, which was parked outside the hall, actually right that way, last year. And this year is parked outside the B part, which is a new location that we have as Republica. If you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely visit it. The idea behind the Fabmobile, and I won't say too much because Christian will fill you in more himself later, is to have a mobile Fab Lab, a space that can go different places, places where innovation maybe doesn't usually happen. For instance, rural East Germany, where this Fabmobile tools around when it's not at Republica, inspiring young people. Please welcome all the panelists with a round of applause. So the format of the session is going to be that each one of them gets about 5 minutes to present their work, and then we're going to debate it, and of course look forward, as I said, to welcoming you on stage here as well. And to kick things off, I'd like to ask Shalev to go first, please.
Thank you, Geraldine. Okay, we don't need this slide. All right. And this is my kind offering to the elder gods of conferences. It's mostly video game stuff, but if you'd like to. So I'm presenting Designing Tomorrows, and I'm presenting also speculative tourism in a moment. And I know we have some participants of both projects, which sometimes overlap here in the crowd. So can I just get a show of hands? Who here was, part? Yeah, I see some there. Yeah, okay, cool. Nice, hi. Okay, so we have some I'm representing these groups, and I hope that some of you, come on stage later and just participate in the rest of this discussion. Just to give a very brief overview, Designing Tomorrows began as a series of workshops and meetings using speculative methods to try and tackle policy issues in 2015, 2016. There was a few meetings concerning with the future of the nation state, the future of body of work, bringing together designers and experts and activists from different fields. And in the last 2 years, we are trying to form a sort of think tank out of this group. We had quite a successful meeting a few months ago here in Germany, gearing up towards a publication at the end of the year. And this think tank that is generally in the area of futurology, which is kind of a hot area, is kind of still, it's still a work in progress, and it's still trying to understand what it wants to be. But from where I'm standing, I can say there's like two things that right now make Designing Tomorrows unique in one way or another. And maybe that will change, but that's, again, I'm presenting works in progress. So the first thing I recognize right now that we're doing, that's maybe not unique to us, but not everybody's doing it, is that we're focusing on speculation as an alternative to prediction. And speculation is going to be a recurring motif in this panel, I think. Predictions' deterministic nature robs the future onlookers in the present from their agency. It's inviting us to do nothing while the future just happens. And through speculative methods, we aim to create agency with a firm belief that we do not live in a predetermined world, something that prediction may sometimes cause us to think, powerless to shape what's coming, but that we have the ability to imagine positive futures in order to actually build the world we want to live in. Speculative fiction sometimes marks the target in order to see how we might get there. Second, and I'm going to get to that in a second, we are actively working to create accessible tools. That's why we're working on a publication. Methods for speculation that can be easily shared, adapted, and used. And just so to present my other project, this was inspired by the 2016 iteration of Designing Tomorrows, together with another designer who presented last year, Mushon Zeraviv. Speculative tourism is taking the ideas of Designing Tomorrow and making a kind of an aesthetic product out of them that aims to do more. We're taking speculative writing, and by working with different authors and activists, creating speculations that are adapted into audio tools, the type of historical tools you work with your phone, and has a GPS locative app, and you hear stories, but you hear stories of cities happening 200 years from now, bringing the speculation to a kind of a eye level where you can more clearly imagine how it might feel to be there and the tension between what we're talking about that might happen in the future and how our reality is right now. So I don't know how, I have like a minute or two left. Maybe I'll get to some other stuff in the rest of this presentation. I want to just show you an example of one of the methods we're using and how we're thinking about it now. So one of the speculative methods we're using is called For Futures. We adapted it from a book by the same name by Peter Freyes, who also presented here in Republica last year. And Peter Freyes takes two questions about the future that he's unsure about and turns them into axes of uncertainty. And then in his book, he creates out of the quadrants that those two axes create 4 possible futures, ways that society might unravel in the far future. What we like about this method of thinking is that it takes us away from the positive-negative dichotomy that we used to think about the future with. So we used to think about utopia and dystopia, you know, the best-case scenario and the worst-case scenario. So like in this example, you know, we're thinking about will society become more individual, or will there be more solidarity and more unification? Will humans prevail over nature, and will nature prevail over humans? And doesn't matter who you are, you probably have some bias that leads you toward thinking one of these quadrants is your utopia, right? Maybe you think that if there's solidarity and we prevail over, the dangers of nature, we get to this kind of Star Trek utopia. And maybe you're thinking, on the other hand, there's some kind of dystopia you're imagining, and that's, nature over humans and individuation. You're thinking of some Mad Max dystopian desert where we're all, living in tribes. What's interesting about thinking in quadrants is that it forces you to consider these 2 other quadrants that you didn't think of. And those quadrants are always not the worst case that you imagine, not the best case that you imagine, and it helps you imagine futures that are not exactly what you would lean towards to. If I had to just ask you to, give me a wild sci-fi speculation of the future. So these methods can sometimes kind of break you. We have this tagline for speculative tourism, free the political imagination. And by using some of these methods, and maybe I'll present another one later, we're trying to do that with our participants in our workshops. So I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, Shalev.
Can you change the computer?
And Michelle, I'd like to ask you to go next.
If we can get out.
How do I change to the next presentation?
There we go.
I think just to recap quickly, the question whether prediction versus speculation is one that I'm looking forward to debating together, especially as we're looking to use some of these methodologies in very political contexts and not just in the design context and the artistic context that some of us are working in. And I'll use the time whilst we're changing the presentation. Okay, I'll pop in a question then. The meeting that you mentioned earlier this year, you presented some of the methodologies from your work as well. And I found it really interesting because I work very much in different political contexts, but you're a games designer. So when you presented some of the tools that you use to build worlds, it was really they were super simple, but it was kind of an eye-opener where you started at a different point to design a society, design different structures, different interaction formats. Do you know, is that something that you learn in your work as a games designer, also how these methodologies can be applied to different contexts other than designing games?
This is a hard one, and whatever I answer now, this is recorded, and somebody gonna... okay. there's a term that is usually used in prediction science, in math, that's called possibility space. Right, but when game designers sometimes talk about possibility space, they don't talk about this hard mathematical concept. They talk about allowing a space where the player can kind of test things out. The range of interactions that can happen when you build a world before you write a story for it. You are inviting players to see how it is, how it feels. In a way, when we talk about what's cool about game design, is that it's not about telling people what happened. It's telling people how it might happen, and that's why I like to write worlds before I write even, I used to teach narrative design in some college in Israel. I always told my students, don't write a story, don't write characters. Give me the entire world of the game and excavate the characters only in the end. Because the world might allow you to kind of think how things might happen before you decide what happened.
It's interesting because we work a lot with methodologies like creating personas and different things where you create from a sort of design thinking approach, and that sort of meta level perspective is sometimes left out. So I think it's quite complementary. You're welcome to chime in since we're doing the discussion part before the presentation part. I was thinking that Christian, since you don't have slides, maybe we'll jump the queue and have you go next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, I jumped the panel on short term. That's why I don't have slides and just do this bit out of the pocket. Yes, my name is Zöllner. Thanks for the introduction, and I just briefly say something about science fiction and my perspective on how science fiction can help us to think of preferable futures. And I just want to dump that very utopian feeling a bit, because I want to talk a bit about the book that I can recommend everybody, and it's called Lab Coats in Hollywood, and it's from I think 2013, was released at MIT Press from an author called Dan Kirby. And Dan Kirby was stating, or was mostly talking about the role of scientists in the production of Hollywood movies. And that's why I want to say that, and he makes a lot of very nice examples of that. For example, my most favorite one is from the movie called Threshold. It's from 1984, 3-ish, something like that. And it's about transplanting an artificial heart into a woman's chest. And it was never there's two stories I tell. There's the film story and there's a reality. And in the film story, that never happened before. And in reality, the same. So the director said, okay, we need an advisory board of scientists. And the scientists said, well, let's use that and proclaim a very positive story of what happens when we replace an organic heart, and take it out and put a machine in. So, in 1984, it was wow, that's soul here and taking it out, and then we get all robots. And they made it in the movie that it looks it gets a happy end. And in the same time, the guy was called Jarvik. I forgot the first name. He was working on that artificial heart so hard, and in real life, so that he used that Hollywood movie to massage this positive story of having an artificial heart into an American public. That when he came up 12 months later with the first real transplantation of a human heart, it was not such a scandal of wow. So it was basically in the pop cultural and public hive mind thing, a possible future that might happen, and everybody saw it in the cinemas, and why it went out good. Let this guy do this transplantation. So then, Dan Kirby calls these kind of like narratives diegetic prototypes, like prototypes that exist not as defenses of a. Or like we have an idea and we build a prototype that has to defend this idea in reality. Like my favorite example is a chair. So I think of a chair, but a model of a chair, a prototype shall work like a chair, so I can sit on it. A diegetic prototype tells in a diegesis, in a story, this how great this idea of a chair is, or in this case of a heart transplant. And in the philosophy, in the world of philosophy, there's this like very tiny niche of a philosophy of thought experiments, and there is also this idea of narrative prototypes that if we create a contrafactual or a what-if scenario, we have to build that sort of story that explains the whole idea of it. And just in my notes. Then you, Shalev, were talking about this. Cracking up the binary between utopia and dystopia, and I really like this four futures thing, and I really want to add, because I don't like I'm in an industrial design department at the university, so I always have to think a few dimensions more, like the third, for example, and then I would add an X more to that, and I would like to add like preferred and predicted, and then you get. Like you can have like a wormhole shortcuts through this quadrants where you can see. Or no, I ask, wouldn't that just bring more insight into these scenarios if we add this X to that? I don't know. And what do I want to say? And then yes, and I want to say that if we come to a preferred future, like the one that we want to have. It's about us as designers to make these preferable futures in a way happen. That's what we do with the Fab Mobile bus that we, as a design studio, design to bring like creative technologies to kids and the rural areas. So and that's what I always wanted to do in front of a big audience. I want to cite Beyoncé, and she said, I know that there are people like it, because she had this like beautiful movie on Netflix, and there she says, you only reach what you can see, and that's what I really think is important when we create something that is visible to people, then people can follow, and that's why I think it's important to showcase preferred futures so people can adapt to it and come along with us into that, like, one of these preferred futures. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I wish people would quote Beyonce more at Republica. So thank you for that. A big round of applause, please, for our wonderful stage managers. They did a great job problem fixing here. Michelle, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to start by quoting Beyonce. No. So, just shortly, like Geraldine mentioned already, I'm not really from sci-fi, but from the intersections of sociology, design, and politics, and so my work deals with things like the sociology of things, politics of agency, and politics of objects. And I'm going to start a little bit dystopian here, but then I'm going to try to bring it back with a little bit of DIY hacking hope for you. So, we live in times right now where all the borders have been breached between nature and culture, human and machine, object and subject, and fiction and reality. Of course, the borders are shivering right now. Where we've known this since Donna Haraway, at least in 1985, we're all cyborgs, and we no longer know where we end and technology begins. Where bodies are tracked and traced, life mined for data, capitalized on to a large extent, and where even the mundane artifacts that are in us, in this case this is a digital pacemaker, even hearts become hackable. Where what we design designs us back, and we design systems to monitor ourselves, to monitor each other. We also design systems to monitor other systems. And so that's a little bit where we ended, to an extent. where we don't always know who extends who, and when we become the extension of the system. These are people trying to help Google map the entire Earth. Where we sometimes manage to make a revolution, but we don't always manage to think about the politics of the objects behind that revolution, and where sometimes one might wonder who's making the visions. So that was the dystopian part. So we can think about whether we're living in an algorithmic aristocracy right now, where the five rule the many, whether it's turning into ubiquitous capitalism, as everything chips find their ways into our coffee machines and sneakers, or perhaps an object-mediated democracy that we're looking at right now. But so how do we bring it back to try to deal with these kind of subjects when we're so embedded in this before, to bring it to the extent, as Willem Flösser puts it, we become programmed by the programmers who have been programmed. And how do we bring it back to materiality? I have to ask as a designer. When, as Karen Barrett said, language matters, discourse matters, culture matters, we've talked a lot about this, the only thing that doesn't seem to matter anymore is matter. So, bringing that back again, I was thinking about speculative actuality as a tactic, because I'll present to you very shortly in a few sentences some projects where I tried, these are very DIY hacks that I did in the context of a PhD project with Florian Conradi, who's sitting over there, where we thought about how to hack the now in order to access some of the hidden mundane politics of the things that we live with every day. So, for instance, one of the things we did is, instead of a smart home, we tried to make a mad home. So we tried to create here social situations and then to experience them. So they're kind of like experienceable fictions. So in times, of course, where we're very embedded in the Internet of Things, for instance, and things are producing us based on what we like and what we always do. And so we thought, how can we make things which run on serendipitous, completely irrelevant parameters? So we had a radio every day. We did this for months in our 39 square meters apartment. Radio, which told us the most irrelevant news. Internet, which had not near enough data and was incredibly slow. The one light in the apartment went on and off on its own terms, and the alarm did too. So we tried to live according with this, got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, thought to turn everything around. In a sense, by hacking culture, hacking our own habits, this did sort of release, surprisingly, for very, very simple hacks built out of lost and found, what we had in the house, did really bring up a lot of sort of our habits and our dependencies and created quite the social drama at home. We traded data on a black data market and whatever. We got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, so we started reading our own spam to see who we might also be. Things like this were from just this, changing the parameters. The next experiment we did was we tried to get social with an AI. So in times where artificial intelligence, for instance, is becoming the new middleman in our lives, mediating us very much and negotiating knowledge and hierarchies, we wondered, what is it actually? So we took the example specimen of a Google HomePod, put it in a box, since we didn't want to look at a Google HomePod, wanted it to be anything. And then we went through, we invited it into our home, we interviewed it as you would a roommate moving in with you. We also asked it questions that the FBI asks when it hires people. We went through that, then we invited it in. First we had some hallway talks with it, we played games to try to keep it in conversation. Then in the end we sat down and drank a bottle of wine with it, got a bit up close and personal, asked it about gender and ethics and where it really comes from. And we did that, you could say, in order to become AI whisperers. So in order to try to understand what are really the bias is, what is programmed into this, how can we speak with it differently, to try to open up the technology before we assume so quickly what it is. So in the end, we made a hack with our own voices, which asked it periphery feminist questions, 24 hours. And so they were chatting away in the hallway. So it was asking, like, what is, where is, what is, who is? And Google was like, I'm sorry, I don't know, but I'm always trying to learn. So we tried to sort of infuse into it sort of feminist knowledge and see if we could sort of engage into machine unlearning. Last project in 30 seconds. Do I still have 30 seconds? Yes. We tried to, in the end, merge with the system, since we're all cyborgs anyway. So in times of tracked and traced bodies, where we're read, profiled, and made sense of constantly, we tried to see how we could basically spam the spammers. So it's a series of interactive tattoos and a cloak. And in terms of the cloak is filled with NFC tags, and I was wearing it. And it triggers with my phone and my jittery gestures, just all sorts of things that Michelle wouldn't search for and who Michelle isn't. So, and it did that constantly, and we were really just trying to see if we could spam the spammers with information, if we could perhaps hide in the light of an overproduction of data, aligning with all of these systems to create sort of a new kind of perhaps counter apparatus, in a sort of DIY hack way. So, last slide. In a way, for me, this was fictions because we created fictions and then we lived them as a little experiment. So they were sort of living in a speculation. And we tried to do that in a way, I think both the speakers have said until now, between utopia and dystopia. In this case, between theory and praxis, because it was a design research experiment, and between speculation and actuality. So try to sort of shiver in between the borders to get an access.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Of course, I would now love to discuss why you don't usually Google funny cat video summer, but I don't think we have time for that in this session. I would like to pass it over to Sina, both the clicker and the microphone.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here to perform my method. I'm Sina. I'm a writer and an activist. It's a contradiction. I'm one. I published a book in January with utopian riddles. Here we are. Oh, this is to go back. Oh, fuck. Sorry. And yeah, there are 14, maybe 13, I'm not sure anymore, fantastische Erzählungen in it, which you can't translate because fantasy isn't fantastic, so it's best translated into close fiction, maybe. So I published this in January, and what happened? It's pretty recent for me, January. So people do say stuff about it. Nice. But my favorite one, I actually fell from my chair when I read that. What a hack. As first of all, this is a work of fiction. Secondly, I think of it as post-capitalistic. And what did I do? I actually broke all the rules, which are stupid. Where do I start? I think 5 or 6 years ago, I gave a talk here at Republica. It's about digital identity, game designing, modern UI unfolding on Facebook, and social networks in general. After that talk, a large publisher came to me and telling me they have the right, they were offered the rights for Jay McGonigal's recently published bestseller, but they would love to do it with me. The bestseller was called, some of you probably know her work, and the work, Reality is Broken, Why Games Make a Better One. I knew her work back then, and I agreed on many points, liked it, but disagreed on others too. But when that happened, I thought, yes, reality actually is broken. How come that I should be to get offered so much exposure about a book I haven't even written yet? I thought, reality is broken, but if I don't stop playing with its rules, it keeps being like that anyways. So what I did was I broke all rules. So by that time I worked for a game developer creating mobile games and Facebook games. My team was like 5 people, and I was just 20 or something, so I quit. And I started to detach from everything, which didn't make sense to me. What happened is you become really alone. You do go to all kind of weird places where people do weird stuff, artistic places, where people try stuff out to work it out in different ways, if it's artistic or institutional. I didn't take any money, I just simply tried to survive. Even broke my own rules, which I came up with, obviously. I became more lazy, even too lazy for the hedonists. And I thought writing the whole book would maybe just take 3 months. It took 5 years. I didn't even care anymore if it would ever get published. Actually, I still think it's quite stupid that it ever got published. I started at some point to compromise and walk. Do it to friends being pretty disappointed of my disappearing energy. So my method is actually not having one, and to talk less about it and do more about it. It's chaos, pure chaos, and constantly trying to free myself. So this means at some point I found a small publisher, which is really good because then you can start ongoing doing shit like protesting against being read and like just wearing weird glasses, making sure you get the message out why you keep going. So at the book fair, for example, when I presented the book, I started taping people from the industry so they get invisible for facial recognition. I can keep going and fighting and doing my activistic work against, because obviously I'm in an industry which gives itself rules. Are called copyright rules, and I published a book, so I'm one of those creators. So work is keeping going, and I keep breaking rules. And yes, I dedicated my last 5 years of my life to create utopian riddles, with all the aspects you mentioned earlier about why it is desirable and what could possibly be a desirable future. After or because of experiences of working for a company creating addictive games using the same data Cambridge Analytica did at the time, probably being the only girl and sometimes the only one with a degree in humanities in the room. But I still believe no one has a superior access to what the future should look like, actually. So there's only one thing we, as privileged as we all are here, can do. And it's constantly reflecting those privileges. This world has shitty rules maintaining our privileges. We're here, and we have to break those rules in order to change them, acting together carefully.
Thank you so much. It is such an important and such a powerful point that you ended on. Who has the authority, but also who has the ability to design the future? And how do we make that a more democratic exercise? I'd like to throw a first question to the panel, but please feel free if anybody feels like now's a point where you'd like to share some of your approaches to your work or some methodologies or some questions to come up on the panel. How do you deal with that in your work? The sort of maybe a little bit of a balancing act that we want to, I think a lot of us work also in open source contexts and have a very strong sort of open source mentality, so we want to share the work we're doing, we want to share our methodologies, but everything we create, we also create from our individual contexts and positions. And sometimes when we want to share things and give people the power to use and reuse them, it also though means that we're sort of pushing our ideas and also our ways of doing things out there. Is that something that you think about and you try to address in the context of your work?
Yeah. Oh, wait, I have to do this? My first headset, sorry. So, yes, absolutely, and of course. And I just felt touched there for a second because, of course, what I showed now was from a PhD project, but we try to upscale it in the context of the Weizenbaum Institute right now, where we run a research group on critical making, which is all about DIY and maker and open source and how you can empower people to use technologies by themselves to do their own hacks, obviously. And in that context, maybe just two examples, which are, I think, from people we've worked with, since we work with then communities who also do that. One was speaking here right before us, Sina from WoLab, and I think that's an example of, for me, like this speculative actuality in realities, which is a really nice thing. So I had the chance to visit WoLab in Lomé in Togo in February, and that's an example for me of someone who really prototyped a space which doesn't necessarily fit into all the logics and rationales as a space, but said, okay, I make a maker space here, talk about Silicon Village, hashtag high low tech, and see what African technology, innovation, smart cities can now mean for the people on the ground. And I think another example is that we work a lot with feminist hackers right now, and this idea of, for instance, which is really practical, of creating feminist servers and really sort of a different internet, an internet with feminist principles, for instance. There's a lot of examples of really applying this bottom up and saying, what else can technology be?
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on that question?
Just add in, because I feel, don't get me wrong, it's not about that I want our fantasy to stop to think about the best possible word. It's the contrary. Like, I mean, it's not that our fantasy is wrong. I feel more that the rules we do have in place, I mean, we definitely need like the most creative spaces and there's much space for creativity even in our shared places to come up with those futures. So it's not being too critical about what we come up with, because it's still fantasy and it's our fantasy, so it has to be as free as possible. But we have to, I mean, that's why, yeah.
Yeah. Is that something, I mean, you teach these methods to other people, so the sort of responsibility in speculation, how does that feature in your work as a teacher?
I think, like what you said, make me really think about like all this, like thinking about privilege comes to that kind of, like for us very privileged people, to the moment of like stopping, like whoop, stop, okay, privilege in the building. So we have to think about that. And like, because I make this all the time, I'm quite okay with, okay, I go on. And then I learned that it's all about, in the same way that you talk or produce, you also should listen in a way. So that's why, like if we are in this position, like writing a book and creating a design object that has been seen by a lot of people or used by a lot of people, it's also about to, okay, but what is you as an audience or consumers or like prosumers or whatever position to that? And with that, like from our I can't really say from an academic point of view, because that's why I always try to tell the students, listen to the people and rethink your vision. Is it now guilty? I don't know. Is it just the wrong word? Applicable, gültig, valid. Yeah, not guilty. It's always the problem. But from our work in the design studio or in this like non-profit organization we have, in which we organize the tour of a rolling fab lab through rural areas, it's what the key learning from the very first moments of, okay, wow, these kids in like East German rural areas are not as we expected, and they act and think totally different, and we were just really had to go on our conceptual break and okay, we just see them doing their things and see, okay, how can we get along their reality into a future of that they can prefer, not that we prefer, and that comes to the point that we have to accept laser cutting, 187 Straßenbande badges like all day long and Fortnite badges all night long, but on that way they learn and see, okay, I can do that myself, and this like empowerment, I think that's an important thing along the expectations of an audience or whatever.
Do you want to come in? Well, I'll ask one more question otherwise, quickly. So I'll ask one more question and then I'll open it up for you, your questions as well. I started getting into all this more or less, like I started getting into looking and together with you guys collecting, let's say, different methodologies that can help us on this way of, as we've been saying, developing desirable futures. One of the reasons was because I was in a lot of design thinking workshops with policymakers and felt that they fell flat at some point. So we ended up, making nice ideas for things, but it never actually translated into useful policy recommendations. So in the political context I work in, they were always nice to have, but not really successful. So I wanted to see what else is out there that would put us into this playful mood and sort of free our minds, but lead to more concrete results. And part of this journey has been finding methodologies that you presented earlier and sort of piecing them together. So for instance, the 4 futures is one of them. Another methodology, none of these were developed by us, we just found them and started adapting them, is called backcasting, where it's kind of the opposite to predictive analysis. You don't start with the now and look into the future. You start with the future and you work back in time. And you can use this in a lot of different ways and different kind of steps. You can make this in a half a day or a 4-day. And we felt that adding together these different methodologies gives us a little bit more depth in our approach and our work. So I'd like to throw the question out to you, and I hope this isn't too tricky for you, especially coming from a design context. Where do we balance the sort of playful tinkering that we want to allow our minds, but make sure that we're able to also create serious outcomes? So sort of the boundaries of some of the work that we're doing and how to avoid that playfulness trap, perhaps.
Now it's your turn.
But somebody else can start too.
Time.
You mean with more time comes more depth, basically?
That was the question I was going to pose to the panel, but I think it's really hard. Like one of the things that define, I think, all of our practices is that we're expected to make something aesthetic or even funny sometimes, and art has its own purpose, right? And every time we make something beautiful, I think it was very clear in creating tours for speculative tourism, that every time we make something beautiful or inserted a joke, I had this pause of like, oh shit, am I not being a good activist right now? I don't have an answer for this.
But it's something that we're all collectively thinking about.
Yeah, because I'm an artist, I'm a game designer, I like making beautiful things, and when I see a beautiful thing, I have this immediate reaction, this justifies itself, it must be in because it is self-justified, and I can't reconcile this. I don't know if I can. I think maybe I should just shove in enough truths that are purposeful, so they balance out the beautiful things I put in.
And maybe it's not completely solvable, because this is another very good point that you made. Sometimes narratives or fictional works will go further. That will land on a CEO's desk, but the article that perhaps a journalist wrote and researched won't, because it's just out of their field of vision. I want to bring another person up on stage. Eden Kupanitz, please give a big round of applause for him. Eden has also been part of this journey that we've all sort of embarked on here, and has given a number of great talks at Republica, but I somehow feel that the one that you're going to give this year is going to be the most popular. It's on heavy metal, but we won't talk about that now. You can see Eden on another stage on another day. Do you want to add to Shalev's answer on the question?
Thank you so much for having me on the stage. I think for me, I'm the science fiction guy of this entire thing. That's my passion. I do other stuff, but that's the thing that I'm most interested in. And I think one of the most important terms that I've learned in the last few years when talking about this stuff is suburban science fiction. And that's science fiction that takes the American suburban conservative values and just launches them into the future. So he's dead, so I can say whatever I want about him, but Robert Heinlein was like the king of that. You have spaceships and intergalactic empires, but all relationships are heterosexual, 2 kids and a dog and a lawn. The lawnmower is like fantastic and sci-fi and cutting edge, but you still mow the lawn every morning and you pay your taxes. So I think to answer your question of what can we do to make things concrete, whenever we speculate, we have to stop and ask, what is my privilege preventing me from seeing? And what other people around me have different sets of privileges? Because no one, almost no one on the planet is free of privilege entirely in relationship to others. So when you make it collective, when you have 5 people on stage, and then 50 people on stage, and then 500 people on stage, and you do these workshops, you're trying to find each other's blind spots. And that's why we can't do this alone. That's why writing is not good enough. Because writing is a very solitary act. We need to write together. We need to think together so that we can kind of catch each other's blind spots.
Can I ask him a question?
Of course.
Welcome to a new expert. Now, I just wanted to ask you as a science fiction knower, if it hasn't also, because I think maybe your link to policy is too far. I think critical reflection, I think theory, I think activism, bringing inclusive scenarios, and then maybe there's a level where you can tie your conclusions together and give them upwards, but I think otherwise the link might be too direct. But in terms of science fiction, there's of course a whole history of like feminist science fiction. There's things coming up like Afrofuturism, cli-fi with climate change, all of these things. Is it diversifying? Because that's a good place to start, like to open up imagination, like the way that science fiction already is?
That's a fantastic question. My formal training is in history, so I have an allergy to narratives, to like linear narratives of something becoming more and more diversified. And I think science fiction is a great example. In the 50s, you basically had white men writing science fiction. Lots of other people did, but those white men suppressed them and didn't publish them and stuff like that. And in the 70s, you had an explosion with the new wave of science fiction, famous names like Ursula Le Guin and Margaret Atwood and Samuel Delany and others. And then in the 90s, everything became this like pastiche cyberpunk, again written by very specific people, and now we're seeing a return. So it's not like a linear narrative. But the interesting thing is that those radical movements are communities. People who write feminist science fiction and people who write Afrofuturistic science fiction, they write together. They publish each other's work. They do anthologies. They do workshops. They know each other. They have no choice. The solitary figure can only be the privileged figure because only a privileged figure has the entire institution standing behind them. When you're fighting against, when you're being radical, you have to work together. And we're seeing it in practice. These authors work together.
I think you all want to respond to that. Let's have some quick responses from you. I know this is not something you can answer too quickly, but I want to leave a couple of minutes for your questions. Do you want to?
Thank you. As I feel, let's push this back to then we did have an OY president here telling us today that the digital space, we should make sure to democratize it. And I wonder, do I want this guy to tell me this in this space, for example? Right now, why the space on the streets, on the way here, I kind of, nearly died while clashing with a car. We both with the bikes. Well, we have no space on this street. The space isn't shared equally. Do I want this guy to talk about this and take my attention, telling me this bullshit, for example, and not solving those problems or those things which are not solved well? And while German cars kill many people each year in Germany alone and all over the world, I don't want to know. This is just another question to lead back and also maybe as a feminine science fiction writer
But
these
then
days,
here's a reflection for all of you.
using the room I have.
Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, Sina, but here's a reflection for all of you, because right after the elderly white gentleman spoke a young Kenyan woman, but half the room left. So it's also like, who has our attention and our focus, and who, you know, do we listen to those who are already in power or those who we want to be in power?
I just want to add a question or a remark, because that's what I really like, the fact of the community writing. And I was thinking about, like, what do we need? Like I said, time, because that's what mostly is needed. But in the stories of the science fiction, like you said, the Robert Heinlein stuff, I just came with the Jetsons, you know? There's like a typical 50s suburban stuff. But there's also this like hero thing that is happening all the time, which is a representation of the lonesome individual writing the book. So you have a community as an answer to the privileged one single person, which might be also the answer to your question, like what do we need is the community that, okay, not layouted, like outsources we faced the problem and we have a solution, please community take care of that. So I know that it's not really safe thing, but the community to have a time, have a community and people that do it in the end, and that have the time and the bold space for realizing what has been thought in a design thinking workshop, that might be a good thing.
Yeah. Okay, let's do this super quick. I'm sorry, this has gone so fast. I hope you feel the same. Do you want to shoot me 2 or 3 questions from the room? Give me a sign of hands. Oh, was I expecting so many hands to go up and there's none going up? That is okay too. If you prefer to have a conversation that is more cozy, I hope that all of us will together go and consume a beverage after this, and you're very welcome to join us and discuss with us there. Okay, one hand's gone up and somebody has a microphone. Please go ahead.
I normally don't like people who make comments when it's for questions, but really quickly, I'm doing feminist sci-fi writing workshops.
Woo.
And yes, and I thought I just wanted to share that it's a really inclusive format, because I think it's really nice to write together, to think what kind of inequalities do we have now, and then to kind of imagine a future. And it has been super inclusive so far, so I can just emphasize on doing more sci-fi writing workshops with people. Yes.
Thank you, that is awesome. Is there anybody else who would like to share or ask a quick question? Okay, in that case, okay, one person up here. There's a microphone coming to you.
As a brutal noob, I just quickly wanted to ask, how do you actually write science fiction in general? Or, I mean, this is basically the first step, I would guess.
Do you want to give a quick answer to this one?
Just do it. Just do it. Really.
Can I do the same that we did yesterday? I want to quote you again to close this panel with the same quote that I used yesterday, because it's just something that really stuck and resonated with me. Maybe a quick show of hands, who was at the Netzfest session yesterday? Okay, then it's good. You get to hear it twice. So maybe, yeah, to close this panel, I'd like to quote you in saying that your short stories are not utopias, because you cannot create a new utopia alone. It needs a community of people to create a utopia. And I think that's such a beautiful statement, and I think I'd like to leave you all with that. I hope that you've enjoyed this panel. I hope you're going to come and join us for a drink and a conversation off stage now.
7:15 at stage 8.
And yeah, I hope you're going to be at Eden's Heavy Metal Talk at 7:15 at stage 8. I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you all so much for being here with us today.
We